Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call the June 5th meeting of the State Allocation Board to order. Please call the roll.
Certainly. Senator Allen? Senator Nguyen? Here. Senator Pan? Here. Assemblymember Nazarian? Assemblymember Chavez? Here. Assemblymember O'Donnell? Here. Juan Morales? Here. Cesar Diaz?
Here.
Daniel Kim?
Here.
And Orena Ortega.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Our first item of business will be the minutes from the April 24th meeting. Any comments, edits to the minutes? All right.
Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. All in favor of approval of the minutes, please say aye. Aye. It passes unanimously. And Lisa?
So the executive officer statement, there's a few items we want to share today. There's a current priority funding round that just opened on May 10th, and that wraps up on Thursday, June 8th. So any project that received an unfunded approval, even as part of the consent agenda today, will be eligible to submit certification for the fall bond sale. And again, there's specific requirements as far as the type of documentation they have to submit for that fund release, but then that's in the future. We also have a charter round that actually closes today at 5 o'clock, and so we'll have some updates for the board in the next coming weeks about how many applicants that we did receive. We also want to give the board an update. We just apportioned projects on April 24th, and the timelines for those projects to come in is July 24th, and we were encouraging districts to submit their certification for the fund release early because we might have some issues with closing out of the fund accounts with the controller's office. So we wanted to remind folks that the fund release documents should be submitted early as possible. We also have 3 projects as part of the consent agenda, one as an appeal, and 2 items in the consent agenda for the seismic mitigation program. And that's over $12 million. And we also have some instructional videos for the seismic mitigation program of how to walk through the process, not only for our office, but the Division of State Architect, and quick, easy tips on how to submit cost estimates and funding applications. So those should be up on our website sometime mid-June. And with that, we also wanted to announce the next meeting is in a few weeks, June 28th.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions? Any public comment on that? Welcome, Senator Allen. So if there isn't any objection, I'm going to suggest we move right to the items under tab 7 so that we can take up those action items prior to taking up the consent calendar, because they could potentially have some effect on items in the consent calendar. So, yes, sorry. So we'll take up the items under tab 7, and that is the grant agreement and the processing of the acknowledged list as it is known. So we'll move to item 7.
Yes.
Lisa?
So we wanted to get your attention on page 79 and tab 7. We wanted to share with the board, I know we had a meeting last month, and we provided the board a template of the grant agreement, and we also had recommendations at a prior meeting that the grant agreement template would be applying to all projects, including projects on the true unfunded list and every project on the acknowledged list. But we actually had, a very, very broad discussion last month, and we did hear some very important points, not only from the stakeholders, but also by board members. So with that, we did work together with some stakeholders, received some comments. So we actually had a subsequent meeting on May 8th as a result of those comments. And so we did receive written communication from the stakeholders. That public meeting that was held on May 8th, we had about 25 to 30 participants. We had about 175 people view the webcast as well. We also wanted to share and highlight with the board, we made some significant changes as a result of the communication not only we received from the stakeholders, but from the various interested parties and the community. So with that, we are presenting as part of the item is the attachment 1, which is the grant agreement template that actually had some revisions and modifications. So you'll see that items and pages listed that had strikeouts and amendments to that. Also on attachment 2 is the cleaned up version of that of the new template. So the significant things we wanted to share with the board is the amendments we made. So on page 80, I'd like to draw your attention to Our proposal is been modified, and so as part of having the grant agreement in place and the timing of the agreement, it was something that it was very much taken into consideration. We initially proposed that a grant agreement be executed prior to receiving the unfunded approval. We have since modified that, and so the grant agreement, we're recommending that we modified in accordance to one of the stakeholders' comments, that it be applied or in effect before the funds are released. So that's a significant modification we made. And we also are recommending on that the projects on the true unfunded list, the projects that were processed prior to the board change of regulations, over $368 million in projects, those projects be excluded from the grant agreement. So that's a significant change from what we had initially from last month. But the grant agreement would also apply to the projects on the acknowledged list. And those are the projects that haven't been processed by the board. And again, the board changed regulations and didn't want to take action on proceedings. So the grant agreement would apply to them. They would also apply to projects that are being processed currently. So those projects that relate to the old bond program, meaning seismic mitigation program, facility hardship program, the grant agreements would be applying to those projects. So it's a limited universe of projects, close to $70 million that the grant agreement would apply to as well. So with that, I know there's a few concerns related to technology. Those items have not changed, but can I draw your attention on page 81? There is a short summary of the changes that we did modify. As I mentioned before, the timing of the grant agreement, we actually did eliminate and streamline. We did receive some comments about having duplicative information, letters, approval letters from the Division State Architect, approval letters from Department of Education, various approval letters that we have in our office related to financial hardship, so we also eliminated that. We streamlined the definition section as well. We also removed the hold and harmless clause in addition to that. But we wanted to highlight, I know we've been having some various conversations with stakeholders even up to the last few minutes. We definitely had some viable feedback that came in over the last few days, and we definitely want to acknowledge that, for the record, we will be recommending some changes to that, the grant agreement template. So even that, we'll read that into the record as far as what amendments we want to have hold. So with that, staff want to reiterate the importance of having a grant agreement, have clear guidelines for the school facilities program to ensure transparency and greater accountability. This will assist school districts, not only large, but also the small districts that are not frequent players in the program. And this is to ensure that they are successful in having good outcomes with the program, but they also clearly understand the rules of what's eligible to be expended and what items are not eligible to be expended. And it's by program. So every program has a different design as far as eligible expenditures and non-eligible expenditures. So if you have to have both lists as a complement of that. We also wanted to share, as part of the companion item, is not applying the grant agreement to the true unfunded list. We're asking the board to actually approve attachment 5, which is all the projects that have been processed by the board by staff previously, and carry those items to the unfunded list, lack of AB 55 loans, which is meaning those projects will have bond authority awarded to them, and we'll be waiting for a fall bond sale. What we wanted to highlight on page 83 is on the item is there's some projects on that true unfunded list that actually have expired state agency approvals. There's 9 of them specifically. We understand, we've been communicating with those districts that they actually are working with the various agencies, the Division State Architect and Department of Education, to have some letters and approvals reinstated. So we'll be tracking that and giving the board some updates. Again, we want to reiterate to the board that even though the recommendations to take action on those projects, that they don't have the ability to access the cash until they correct that. So we'll be providing updates to the board. There's also several projects that will require a financial hardship re-review, and we will be communicating with those districts to have those financial updates as well. So we wanted to highlight on page 84. As far as what we recommend is, we definitely recommend the grant agreement template and conforming regulations. And we also recommend that the exclusion of the $370 million for the unfunded, true unfunded projects be excluded from the grant agreement. But we also wanted to acknowledge with the template itself, as part of attachment 2, that there be inclusion of language. I know on page 215 of the grant agreement template and 219, 238, and 253. During our discussions, we had some very explicit, it was great feedback that we heard about freezers and refrigerators and stoves. In those circumstances, I know we have language in there currently that says only if used for food service to all students. We definitely think those items need to be, that language needs to be struck out, and definitely keep freezers, refrigerators, and stoves in the agreement itself, not excluding those items. And the purpose is because for various reasons, refrigerators could be used for nursing. The nurse's office obviously could have, medications that need to be housed for students, and also freezers could be used for, various things for science classes, and, obviously chemicals may be properly stored in those, so obviously the need to have that there as well. We also wanted to, so we would definitely modify that language. And as far as exercise equipment, there was a good comment that we heard today. We would also recommend changing the language related to, also on that stamp page, related to if only available for use by all students. So that was a great comment. Thank you, Senator, for sharing that today. So with that, in that regards, we would be making those amendments. And we're also recommending as well, I know we've heard numerous comments related to the template itself, the grant agreement. What if we've got comments from stakeholders that for an item that's not currently on the list, since we do provide active feedback to our grantees as far as if it's not on the list, this is a service we provide anyway. We definitely provide written clarification, and that written clarification can also be part of the template as well. So we would acknowledge change in the language on page 207 and 259 to include language that would specifically reference that if the district received written communication from the Office of Public School Construction for items not included on the list, and list of eligible and ineligibles, that the local auditors will be seeking that written response as a guideline and tool for allowable expenditures. So again, we'll definitely modify that as well. I mean, that was definitely a concern that we've heard from the stakeholder community, that they have a reference point in the grant agreement template just in case that we have written communication that doesn't meet the list eligibility. So with that, we're recommending the board adopt the grant agreement and the regulations and conforming edits.
Okay. We have several speakers who have signed up to speak. I think, though, before I call the first speaker up, I'll open it up to the members of the board if anybody wants to make any comments or has any specific questions.
Yes, I do.
Sure.
With regard to the ineligible versus eligible list, it looks like what you're saying is we should continue down the eligible path,
Yes.
the eligible expenditure path. Well, I have just a macro level problem with. But with regard to the specific proposal before us today, what you're saying is that the grant agreement would have language that speaks to a letter, so that would give auditors direction, because we're going to get caught in auditor land here real quick,
Yes.
unless we have something real specific in the grant agreement itself. That's my understanding from FCMAT. Could you maybe educate the group here on that?
That's what we're recommending, making a modification to the grant agreement to acknowledge that if the staff does provide letters in reference to a specific eligibility item, and we provide them specific guidelines that those items would be allowable, then this is the edits that we are willing to make today in the grant agreement.
Okay.
So can I also, I think we had envisioned, as I've discussed with staff, how they would handle this is to the extent that an issue comes up that also really warrants further revision of the grant agreement itself. So if a district comes to OPSC and seeks advice on whether something is allowable, OPSC could provide that information in writing. The grant template would have the guidance for the auditor to look at whether there's any such document. But OPSC would also come back to the SAB to request a revision to the grant agreement template. So that
Correct,
issue
yeah.
would be corrected on an ongoing basis. And I think, we imagine over the early months of implementation, those issues are certainly going to come up.
Right.
Great. Thank you. And I have other comments, but I'll wait to hear
Okay.
from the public.
Okay, anyone else before we move to the public comment? Okay, I'll call Mr. Don Ulrich.
Mr. Guajardo, are these mics?
Yes.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the State Allocation Board. My name is Don Ulrich. I'm from Clovis Unified Schools in the Valley, and I represent CASH, the Coalition for Adequate School Housing, as their chair. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to provide input on this important topic. You've received letters from me, and today, really, I just want to summarize what the issues are and the position that CASH has taken on these topics. First of all, the lists. We recommend that the true unfunded and the acknowledged list both be approved, and you direct OPSC to process the acknowledged list as quickly as possible, including, directing them to hire the appropriate staff to process these applications as soon as possible. All these projects were submitted in good faith in accordance with the existing program when they were submitted. That hasn't been changed. And in fact, it was approved through Prop 51 to remain unchanged. Also, allow projects to retain their place in line while getting DSA or CDE reapproval. Additionally, adjust the priority funding deadlines, extend the deadline for current projects to fund with the fall bond sale. You can accomplish this through regulation changes, emergency regulations. Doing so will allow projects approved today to access the fall bond sale. Regarding the grant agreement, and this one, you discussed briefly, but we really recommend that you allow only ineligible expenditures, or, to put it another way, those that you can't purchase. We just feel like this is a more clear, transparent, and more easily accountable. Holding people accountable would be easier with this than what you're recommending, which is listing eligible expenditures. We feel this is more difficult to hold people accountable, and that the prior would be the better way to do this. Again, about the grant agreement, allow it to include prospective projects only. Retroactive application will create more complexity for districts, OPSC and SAB. As you know, many school districts that had eligibility and turned in projects have done these projects with funds that were probably allocated many times for other more important, just as important projects. So if we've already done the project and a new grant agreement changes those regulations, that could be problematic, I think you'd see. Also, with the grant agreement, we do concur with OPSC recommendation for signing the grant agreement at the time of fund release or when you turn in your 5005. We think that's a good change to the grant agreement. And finally, while these are all important positions from a state level, I think even more important is that we hear the effects of moving the program forward as quickly as possible. What that does for our local school districts, for the projects that teachers and kids out there need to have happen, or on the other hand, what happens if we don't move the project forward and we keep taking this valuable time away from getting projects done for kids and for teachers out in our schools. And I think today you'll hear testimony from districts with specific issues, specific projects that are going to benefit kids and teachers, or if they're not funded, are going to be a negative impact on kids and teachers. And really, the reason we're all here is to support our local schools and our districts and help the environment for students and for teachers in the state of California. So if you have any questions, I can answer those at this time.
I have one question. So as I understand the way the template has been drafted, there's a code section reference to every item that's listed as an eligible expense. So this is an attempt to look through all of the relevant statutes of the program and put it into one document. So when you talk about how signing the grant agreement for something that's already been submitted to OPSC or already is, you've already put contracts out on the project, with the exception of technology, where I will acknowledge that's a place where we made a clear change, what is an item of expenditure that you think might come up in a project that you would have, that would be in conflict with the grant agreement?
I think you framed it. It's anything that you purchase, and it is mostly technology. There could be other things on that list that are purchased. And I think for districts that have funds available, that might not be such an issue, but there's many districts that, in hardship cases, that's the money they have. You know, so if, especially the part about, you know, the penalties and those kind of things for projects they've already done, I think would be problematic. That's the main issue there.
Okay. Mr. Kim.
Mr. Ulrich, I mentioned before at our last meeting, I was at the other end of the table receiving state funds when I was at the local government level. And whether it was the small counties or the large counties, we always wanted to get clarity on what was an eligible or ineligible expense. That's why I'm a little unclear why Kesh wouldn't want the local school districts, many of whom have seen massive turnover of staff, administrative staff, who may not know all the rules of engagement. Why you wouldn't want a clear list of what was eligible and ineligible,
Yeah,
especially given that, to my knowledge, with the exception of the discussion regarding technology, there's been no question about any of the other ineligible expenses. So if there's no question about what's on the ineligible list, why not identify that up front for everyone?
I'm here to give you, you know, Cash's position, but I can add what my experience has been, and I think we heard it today. When you have a positive list of what's eligible, it's going to be reinterpreted many times. And that's why I heard that today regarding, I think it was the exercise equipment. And so the position that we're taking, based on experts that have been in the facility world, frankly, quite longer than me, you know, that their experience is the way we framed it, an ineligible list is clear and easier to hold school districts accountable for what your intention is. So, and I think some of those people that have that experience can testify today to that effect. So that's our opinion on it. That's how, you know, the practitioners that have been doing this for decades have seen this, and as a board, that's the position we're taking at this time.
Anything else? I think, thank you, Mr. Ulrich.
You bet.
I'm going to call a couple names at a time so that we can move through the list of speakers expeditiously. Margaret Brown and Robert Pierce.
Good afternoon, Chairwoman Ortega, members of the board, Senator Wynn, especially. I'm from Garden Grove. My name is Margaret Brown. I am the Director of Facilities for Garden Grove Unified School District. I also went to elementary, middle, and high school in Garden Grove, graduating from Bolsa Grande, which is currently being modernized at this time. My mom's also a retired teacher from that district, so I have a lot of ties to that district and that community. I'm here today to talk about a number of our projects that are on the list for funding. Garden Grove, for the very first time, passed its very first bond measure in 2012. In 2010. Never did a bond before that, never actually improved any of our facilities, and most of them did not have air conditioning. I joined the staff in 2013, and we really started going back through the plans and looking at how we could get air conditioning in our schools. We had times when it was 95, 103 degrees in the classroom, and we're asking our students to study physics, take final exams, and it's almost impossible in there. And so we were able to, under the current program, get some modernization funding, get some matching funds, and move those 65 modernization projects through the process. But we also went ahead and started adding air conditioning to our high schools. And Bolsa's first set of 24 classrooms just moved in. They have air. So if it's 94 back home today, they're in air. They go to school through June 20th. So we're very excited about that. But we also needed to pass the second bond. We just did one in November for $311 million because we didn't anticipate adding air conditioning the first go around. And we were very excited when the statewide the voters passed Proposition 51. So we thought, great, we're going to get matching funds. So here we go again. We submitted 14 applications to the state for about $12 million. And all of those applications include air conditioning for our schools. And 12 of those applications are reimbursement. We are actually are in the middle of doing that work or that work is already done, and we're hoping to get that money back. Unfortunately, the state hasn't sold anything from Prop 51. I know we're looking at selling a little bit, and I'm really here to say I hope we sell a lot because we are on a list. Well, what list? The acknowledged list. But that doesn't mean we're anywhere near the top. We're sort of towards the bottom. But we're hoping that if we start selling bonds and OPSC starts working our applications and doing the eligibility, that eventually we'll get that funding because that $12 million reimburses the pot that allows us to air condition the next batch of schools. We're also going to apply for 2 more financial hardship, facility hardship projects, seismic mitigation. We already have 2 projects. We're getting ready to submit 2 more. And of course, I think we go to the front of the list with a facility hardship. So I'm not so worried about that. If you sell some bonds, I hope they'll be for Garden Grove. But what I'm here to say is that I hope we'll sell more bonds and we'll move the projects forward. I'm very happy to hear about the grant agreement that you're going to make us sign it at fund release. With respect to the eligible and ineligible items, the cost for Garden Grove, the amount of state money we get is so small compared to the amount of the construction cost. It's barely 30%. So we're not going to have a problem with the eligible, ineligible. But if this was another time, I would tell you that I really would be concerned about what's on that list. If it only says what's eligible and everything else is not, it can be very complicated as a someone who's responsible to my community and to my board about all of a sudden it's not allowed and now it's coming out of Prop 98. I'll be looking for a new job. Just wanted to share you through those thoughts.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. And you might be interested to know that I graduated from Garden Grove High School.
Oh, excellent. That has air now, too.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board, staff, members of the audience. My name is Robert Pierce. I'm Deputy Superintendent for Business Services at Elk Grove Unified School District. Appreciate your time today. I know you've received a lot of correspondence from people just like myself, including me, so I can keep my comments fairly brief. In short, I am going to urge you and ask that you consider approving option 2 that's before you today, and that you also consider the grant agreement not being retroactive and only applicable to projects that have not either completed or started construction at this point in time. I will tell you from our perspective at Elk Grove Unified, we're in complete support of the notion and the thought behind the grant agreement. I can tell you as a public official myself, there is no other public entity than school districts that want to comply, that want to fulfill requirements and obligations of us, and in that regard, the grant agreement does a good job. We know the rules of engagement. We know how that we can be successful in the expenditure of bond funds, so we appreciate that, and we think it's a really good thing. But again, we don't want that to be retroactive. In other words, we have projects that we've either completed and or under construction, and I would hate to sign a very large document that I can't assure both my board and my constituents that we are fully compliant with that agreement on day one. A little bit about the Elk Grove story. Many of you might already know this. We're a large district. We're 5th largest in the state. We continue to grow, fortunately for us, unfortunately with regard to our lack of facilities. And so we are in a position right now, we have 2 elementary schools that are under construction at the extreme polar opposite ends of our district. We're 320 square miles. We have a school under construction in the city of Rancho Cordova and a school under construction in the city of Elk Grove. Both of those schools are in such a high need right now, absent state funding and absent certain triggers that have allowed us to generate capital dollars. Our board was forced to make a very tough decision and issue $30 million of certificates of participation, leveraging our general fund. All of the neighboring elementary schools in those 2 regions are already on a multi-track year-round calendar. If you're not aware of what that is, I would be happy. It was popular for a time. It's still popular in Elk Grove Unified. Unfortunately, it is not optimal for the educational environment of our students or our staff. Anyhow, neighboring schools all multi-track year-round. Both of these 2 elementary schools will also open this summer, not this fall, but this summer because they're multi-track year-round, also on a multi-track year-round calendar. So you're talking of schools opening with over 900 students on day one. Again, we had to issue certificates of participation just to make those schools a reality. We had nowhere else to send the students. We were up against it with our community. So we're happy to have done that. What we're fearing and where our anxiety level increases is with some of the options before you today. Just know that current law does not allow us to reapply or to apply for new construction dollars if those projects are already occupied. And by the time this is all fixed or corrected or whichever avenue we're going to go down, if in any way, shape, or form we have to reapply as a district, we're on the acknowledged list, those projects would not be eligible for reimbursement from the state. If we receive reimbursement, we need 4 elementary schools, not 2. Those are dollars that are immediately going to go to needs in our district. So in short, we would urge you to consider option 2. We think it's the most fair and equitable for school districts like ourselves, and we would encourage you to make the grant agreement not retroactive. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Just a quick question though. With option 1, it doesn't take the money away. It just I think for those projects that have been in the list for a long time, it just would require the projects to reestablish program eligibility.
So the devil can be in the details in some of the application of that notion. My understanding, sitting before you right now and not having this implemented, is that option 1, technically, I believe you're correct, is that we would have to just justify our existing new construction eligibility as of this point in time. That's not a problem for Elk Grove Unified, frankly. It may be a problem for other districts who add eligibility at the time of their application and built those projects and now won't be able to receive new construction. So selfishly, for me, that's not an issue. I think it would be issues for other districts.
I guess how would it be an issue for another district if they, if it was always an eligible project?
So they theoretically could have either started construction on the project and or completed construction on the project, and they're just awaiting funding. And there could be some results of the Great Recession. As we know, a lot of tentative maps have expired and other things have happened where they may not be eligible for new construction dollars today, and then they would lose funding on those projects, or not receive funding, I should say. Just a technicality, but a significant one.
And if I could just add to that, there could be a situation with districts when they applied for funding, their enrollment trends were going up, and they had eligibility to justify the project, but from that year, they've experienced a declining enrollment. So if you have a downward trend now, they may no longer have the eligibility to support the project that they did when they applied. Especially if there's 3-4 years since the time of submittal versus time of review.
But just to clarify, option 1's for new construction, right?
Yes.
So it's not, I mean, I think one of the challenges is that we've had applications that go back. Now, I can see if a school district's already put in money they built, but I also, because if enrollment trends changed since 2010 and that's when the application is, I think it's a little, if they haven't actually built the school, now we're building a school in a place that the enrollment trends don't support it, that's problematic.
Right.
Yeah, and I don't want to speak for staff, but I think the way it's worded currently, even if you have built the school and you don't have eligibility today, you would not be eligible for funding.
Well, we have staff here. Is that?
Yeah, I think the what's assumed in the options is that I don't think there's any. I don't think we've really entertained the option 3 of sending the applications back. So I don't think the issue of reapplying is going to really.
This was option 1.
Yes, I understand. So just looking at the difference between option 1 and 2, option 1 would require the re-eligibility of the recertification of eligibility, regardless of whether it was new construction or not. It would be you would have to recertify eligibility.
Under option 1, it would be for new construction, regardless of whether you've already built the project or if you have plans that you are waiting to build the project. For modernization eligibility, it doesn't fluctuate as much because once the building hits that year, typically we don't process modernization eligibility down, so it doesn't matter as much. So we're not recommending in option 1 that modernization eligibility need to be rejustified. But for new construction, the concern is exactly as you stated. If the project was thought of in 2012 or 13 and the district has not built the project, or even if they did build the project, we could potentially be spending new bond dollars on facilities that are not needed.
So when you say new construction that's already been built, I think maybe people are getting confused about your definition of the word new.
So we haven't been processing applications for funding since 2012. So we've on the so on our second action item on the applications received beyond bond authority, the board in 2012 decided to keep a list of projects that we would acknowledge but not process. So districts have been submitting funding applications under our two main programs, which are the modernization program and the new construction program. So the applications were submitted as if the old program, or the school facility program was in place, as though the rules would not change. Districts had to certify that there was no guarantee of funding and no commitment that they may not be eligible, that rules might change. So there were some certifications that went along with it. But when the application was submitted, the district was saying, I am intending to add capacity to my district by either the addition of classrooms onto an existing school site or by an entirely brand new school. So those are the applications that we have in-house that have not been processed. So that application package is still requesting funding out of the new construction program because it's adding capacity that we didn't know of prior to that 2012 timeframe.
I guess my question for you is there a way to rejigger option one to make it truly new construction? I understand the point you're trying to make, which is that you don't want people moving forward, like jumping you don't want people being ahead of other folks in line if that project would not be eligible anymore. At the same time, we don't want to leave districts in the lurch, who were doing construction under the, with full faith that they were complying with the program and eligibility as it was. So is there a way to redo option one to kind of allow for that, to kind of correct for that, those different scenarios?
So the options that we've put forth are all for board consideration. So it would really be the board's call as far as what you want to do from a policy perspective. The reason that OPSC has this before the board is because we don't believe we have the administrative authority to process these in any way, and that the board has the flexibility to move forward and require updating eligibility. Within option one, the balance there is just that it is a unique opportunity for the board to really make sure that the bond dollars are going towards projects that are necessary.
Right.
How we arrive at that is could be a board option.
Is the logic of my question sound? I'm just want, as long as I'm not
Madam Chair, I think his
misunderstanding.
logic's very sound. I have a suggestion. I think what you do is you have it apply to projects, under contract after today, so that those projects going backwards would
Just
follow.
the
You could
recertification.
modify.
Are you talking about
Option
just
one.
the recertification?
I'm sorry?
Just the recertification of eligibility?
I think that's what I'm thinking here. If
I think that's a way that it could be structured. To meet your comment, Senator Allen, is that there could be a consideration for projects that have already been built, say through the contract date, projects that have entered into contract after a certain point in time, whether it's today or another day, that they could use the enrollment projections at the time of submittal, versus the ones that have not entered into contracts or have not been built, they would use enrollment projections at the time of review. That could be a way that it could be structured.
But this list, though, has not been processed, so how could you verify that? You can't do that because it has not been processed. Because this is an acknowledgement list. It's not the trusted.
We would need to process it first.
You would need to process it first, and you can't do that without processing it because they're not eligible.
Option one processes it. Option one assumes the processing.
Yeah, so you would basically process the applications, and the applications are required to submit enrollment information at the time of submittal. So the district, so OPSC would have the enrollment projections at the time of submittal to determine whether they qualify based on that information. They would probably need to get updated enrollment information at the time of review to determine whether they have eligibility at that time. And keep in mind that it could be 4 or 5 years between the time of submittal versus the time of review. But to be on this acknowledged list, districts were required to submit the enrollment projections at the time of submittal.
Can I let Mr. Kim jump in? He's asking.
I'm just trying to think of, under option one, what type of school district would be harmed? It would seem that the only type of school district that would be harmed under option one is a school district that kind of bet on the come, recognized that its enrollment was growing, said, I'm going to build anyway, I'm going to be on the acknowledged list, despite the fact that I am not guaranteed any funding, state funding for this, and then somehow the enrollment dipped below projections. Now, if I were the chief business officer of the school, I would know that that applied to me. So have we heard from any schools that say they're going to be harmed by option one?
No, we have not heard from any
So
specific.
that's what concerns me. I wonder, are we trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist? Because if I'm a CBO, I'm going to know that. And if I don't know that, we got bigger problems in that school district. So
I do have an answer for you on that, because you could be in a district, say like Garden Grove, that had some small growth and needed to build an addition at Grove High School that has something like 33 portables on it, and we need to build a 2-story classroom addition. Now, we have not moved forward on that project because that was not a priority in our district, but we could have. We could have done the plans, had the eligibility in 2012 and 2013, and submitted that project. Maybe not have built it because we're pretty conservative in Garden Grove. We may not have built it, but we might have submitted it and spent all the money to and have those sunk costs to build that project. And now, with our declining enrollment, we wouldn't be eligible, but we would have the need. And so I think we need to think about it like that, because you can have needs in different parts of your community and where you're declining. So we may be growing in certain parts and declining in others. And we are, because we cover Santa Ana, we cover Fountain Valley. And so that could happen. I don't have that specific issue because we were just doing straight up modernization, but it can happen to school districts, and you might actually hear from somebody if we ever get down there.
And I can appreciate that situation. I guess my question would be then, is it fair to allow that school district to build something when, if they updated the information, they wouldn't be eligible? Meanwhile, there's other school districts that are now eligible, that are of a higher need, that aren't going to get that. And the other question was, well, you were conservative because you wanted to be fiscally prudent. I think that most CBOs are the same way. So if someone is not like that, why should we give them the benefit of that? I made the wrong forecast, and I'm not even in a situation where I can tell the legislature or SAB that, hey, I would be harmed. Because I would expect a letter from that school district saying that you're really going to harm me, and we haven't seen one to date.
Could we, could I suggest, staff help me out here, if we moved forward on an item 1 to process the applications but require the recertification as sort of not as a final decision on those applications, but to get us some more information about whether there is anyone harmed. Are there any projects that are going to essentially jump ahead of a project that has more critical eligibility? Because that would be the concern that I would have if we approved item 2, is we may be letting projects move forward that clearly should not be ahead of someone else, and in a limited bond sale scenario, that doesn't seem to make sense. But I feel like we're either chasing a problem that doesn't exist, or we're trying to solve when we don't have enough information. Senator Penn.
I'm sorry.
Well, actually, I mean, if we did option 1, and you'd actually, once you process it, you would actually have a list of how many schools are not eligible, and they would then be able to say, well, we still want to move forward. And so we would then be dealing with, well, how many cases are we talking about? And then
But that brings it back to us as a
Brings it back.
right, and then we can look at those and say which ones seem to still make sense, right, or not, given. So then we would have a definition of how big the problem is. If it's
Lisa.
There's currently 280 projects on the acknowledged list that are applying for new construction. And so that's over $1.5 billion in requests. And so just to clarify what the magnitude of the issue. So
We ask the districts to recertify without the staff having to go through an application by application process. So essentially ask them to evaluate their enrollment and see if anyone, sort of self-certifies that they're, at least as a first cut to figure out the magnitude of the problem. Because I get what you're saying. You don't have the staff to, in any quick way, process all those applications and determine how we would move forward. That's, with that many applications, that's the problem. But, yes.
But my question to that would be is how long would that process take for the school district? to process that. I mean, because now we're adding another layer. And so that would be my question is, I think everybody here seems like we want to move forward as fast as we can because it's been almost a decade. And so now, how do we,
But
if
it
we
wouldn't
add
be
in
for
another
naught,
process?
right? They would have to do the recertification if they were moving forward at some point. So we would just be asking them to do that now and submit that as part of their application.
And we want to move forward, but we want to move forward on worthwhile projects. We want to make sure there's enough money for those projects that really need them.
Yeah, but her question has been answered, the timeline associated with that.
For certification within the district?
For us to do it? 60 days. Of course, it's summer, we're really busy. Yeah, 60 days.
I'm sorry, isn't it largely a matter of the projection for enrollment that's going to drive this?
So the 5001 form, which is the form that OPSC uses to establish your enrollment projection, it is just a form, but there's a tremendous amount of backup to that form in order to justify future enrollment through tentative track maps, final maps. There's a lot of work to do with your local planning jurisdictions and others in order to complete that. So there is some time associated with it, and you're certifying, so it's got to be accurate.
Madam Chair, can we ask the representative from Cash up here? Because Cash, I believe, you represent a variety of school districts throughout the state, right? I mean, for the record, I graduated Garden Grove High as well. So, so we love the Garden Grove High today. We're all the Argonauts today. I just wanted to make sure that, if you can, you've heard the discussion up here. I mean, what are you hearing across the state?
Yeah. I think from the Cash Board of Directors and the people we're talking to about this issue, it's about those districts that in good faith had eligibility and they went forward for a new construction project. And now, so much time later, things might have changed. If the program would have been intact, that change still would have happened, and you build schools and you start to decline, but you still have built the school. In other words, you're still looking back. And that's what's problematic for these school districts. I think the other point I would make is that when you are a larger school district, even a medium-sized school district that might have 2 or 3 high schools, you don't just grow evenly all over the school district, right? Now, you can reboundary your districts at certain times to use every room possible, but that's challenging for the community, especially if you get into 5 or 6 high school districts. It's very challenging to do that, and sometimes not even feasible because of the transportation costs. So there's lots of nuances to going back 5 years and making you recertify for those projects that you might have already built. I think the discussion has been great, that looking at finding out where the problems are, how many districts are in this situation. But I would bet, and I think maybe some of my colleagues that speak later, I'm thinking of Mr. Rising from Long Beach, might have the experience to give you some specific examples of a situation they're in or some other district is in. My district, Clovis Unified, has been a growing school district for the last 25 years. So we're not going to face this situation. We're continuing to grow. Any new construction we've done, and we have 2 on the acknowledged list, but we still have eligibility because we're continuing to grow. So it's a really nuanced situation.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any. I mean, at least from my perspective, if the school was actually constructed, with good faith, compliance with the rules as they were, I don't think any of us are. At least I'm not advocating for that not to be covered at all. I think the question is for those that have not been constructed, that would no longer be eligible. We just want to make sure that we're spending our money wisely moving forward. That's the distinction I'm drawing.
Well, then wouldn't that mean that today, going forward after today, the recertification, why would you recertify something that's already been built?
If it hasn't been built,
if it hasn't been built, I mean, really, it's after today that they would have to come in and recertify, I assume, correct?
Well, if we do option 2, then they wouldn't.
I'm sorry?
If we do option 2 as written, then they would not have to recertify.
Right. So I mean, option 2 to me seems to be practical.
Then a district that hasn't built would be eligible to stay in the program.
Even if the
why don't we modify option 1 or 2? I guess option 1, excluding constructed projects and projects under contract by June 5th, 2017.
If I may, I think that's what Mr. Morales was, I'm assuming after that, with option 2, modify option 2 to mean after today or some date in the future.
Senator
So-
Penn.
So what I'm hearing is that, first of all, the question has been raised how much of a problem this really is, right? Is that we've heard about the business manager being, in my mind, first of all, I think we have an oversight responsibility to be sure that the projects we fund actually meet the standards. So there is an importance to establishing program eligibility. Now, if they've already constructed it, then it's going back in time to say at the time you submitted, all right, because you can't just blank check and say, fine, we're not even going to look at it, right? You just spent the money. We don't want to create a situation where people just spend the money without, at least at the time they started construction or at the appropriate time submitted, that somebody's at least reviewed and taken a look at the numbers and said that's appropriate. So, so I think one level is that to either you're going back and looking at the submission time, or if they haven't built it, you're looking at now. And then the question is, to what degree, are we trying to imagine a problem that may or may not exist, as was pointed out. Right. So we also want to make it as streamlined as possible so that we can move these projects funding as quickly as possible while still assuring that people meet eligibility at whatever appropriate time they should be meeting it for construction. Because, again, I think it goes back to we don't want people constructing. Now, I think in general, schools probably don't want to put their share up for projects that aren't going to work. But I do think we have a responsibility for our staff to be sure that people do meet program eligibility. Now, so is there a staffing problem at SAP about doing that or not?
To check each of the projects right now?
It said
process,
it said reestablish program eligibility, option 1.
Right, so under option 1, as we process the applications,
Yes.
that would just be one of the steps that we do. So instead of using the 13-14 enrollment information, we would ask the district to provide us the information for 17-18.
Then those are projects going forward, not back.
Under option 1, it would be
because-
for all projects.
Anything you have.
But then we run into the same conundrum where we have projects that were built based on earlier numbers or projections.
Well, they do need to be sure that they meet the eligibility at the time they start submission, right? I mean, you
Which
don't.
would be option 2.
No, it'd be option 1, right? I mean, the question is which numbers do you use? If they already built it, you'd do it not from 17, 18. You'd do it from the time they
If there was a hybrid of option 1, another
right
version of option
right.
1.
Can I ask a technical question? So when they certify, is it the district they self-certify? Do you, when they submit, they originally submitted, was there any type of formal certification?
We haven't done
They
the
haven't
review
done
on the
anything yet.
applications, but they are signing the forms indicating that the information is
Okay.
correct. But typically, when we process the information, I would say a fair number of times we find some data issues that does need to be adjusted. So they're certifying, but it may be, we may need to adjust it a little
So
bit.
how big of a workload is this for you? Because we want to get these projects up and running, and I know everybody in this room does. But I just wondered, there's all these hurdles I see that we're creating today from my perspective. Even the grant agreement alone, and now we're doing all this other stuff. The grant agreement is getting longer now. So how are you going to get all this done inside your office? What kind of workload does this put on you?
The eligibility for us, that doesn't change the workload moving forward. It just tells us which document to look at. So that won't have an impact on it. So once the board decides how we move forward, then we'll have direction on which information we're requesting from the school districts, and we'll process in the order that the board determines.
So under option 1, right? So option 1 but option 1 doesn't exclude at this point, unless amended, doesn't exclude constructed projects
That is
or
correct.
projects under contract.
That is correct.
Okay, I have
I
I have Mr. Diaz, Mr. Nazarian, Ms. Nguyen, and we'll start there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want basically staff to comment on a lot of the resources that would be spent on and time on combining the two options, right? I think that's sort of a concern for me as well. And I also just wanted to clarify something. For school districts that were able to have the financial resources to move forward with construction, based on the acknowledged, right, portion, they didn't have a promise, they weren't processed, they were just acknowledged. There are other school districts that perhaps did not have the financial resources to move forward, right, because they didn't have the wherewithal, they didn't have the facility staff in the divisions. I feel that some of those school districts might be harmed by that action of doing the combination. Can you clarify that for me, explain that a bit further?
So we do have limited bond authority under the program. So yes, there are districts that may have opted not to participate and submit an application during the time when we were not processing. So those projects right now are behind the $2.4 billion list. So if there is funding that goes to projects that are not necessary, then that's funding that's not going to reach those districts that might be designing their projects now for submittal, now that we do have bond authority available. So.
And may I clarify too? So the action the board takes as part of the $368 million, there's also a portion of that that represents new construction, upward over $100+ million. Then also, if the board concedes on the acknowledged list, there's over $1.5 billion. So again, that's close to $2 billion without having a eligibility rechecked on the $1.5 billion, plus any future applications. So if the Proposition 51 passed with $3 billion in new construction, then over $2 billion has already been committed just explicitly for the bond fund. So it's just a warning that you would only have $1 billion available for any new projects coming forward.
All right, Mr. Nazarian, I think you were next.
Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of quick questions, just so that I can clarify something. Of the 280 or 280 some projects, do you have a ballpark figure how many could run into issues or challenges? Ballpark.
We don't know because we don't have the current eligibility information because it wasn't required to be submitted. So until we get that information, we can't guess because, as was stated by the districts, there are things that we can't just look up the enrollment, so we need to know about the track maps. So unfortunately, at this point, it is a true unknown for us whether or not we're going to have an issue once we were to look at the current enrollment year.
And anecdotally, you haven't been reached out to by any school district to know, even on an anecdotal basis, how many issues you would have.
Right. We have not heard from anybody that has said that rejustifying new construction eligibility is going to cause them a problem.
Okay. So the next question is there, and I should have known this, Bob, but for the public record purposes, it's good to, hopefully it's beneficial to ask as well. Are there legal issues that can be stemming from using the new bond dollars for criteria from the previous bond requirements?
You mean eligibility? The eligibility from the past eligibility?
Same program.
Well, I think.
Are there no changes in the bond requirements? Was there no changes in? Is everything teed up so that there's no issue whatsoever? Can it be challenged?
There was no grandfathering provisions as far as projects on the acknowledged list. So, also when an application came, the board made a conscious decision back in 2012 to change your regulations. It didn't say keep processing, it said stop processing. And it also made very clear about the board, acknowledgement from their local board that this is no guarantee of standing in line that's going to guarantee you a future funding application. So it was very clear about that language. So again, there was no guarantee about what new construction eligibility you should be using at the time you submit an application.
And Mr. Nazarian, more directly, I think the bond does not say anything about the applications we have in-house. That's why we're, yeah, so I think you could ask the question, does it say you can't process them? I think our view is you could send them all back. That's why option 3 is on the.
Can I ask a related question? Related to this, though, I think conversely, if we go ahead with option 2 and proceed to fund a school district that really technically isn't eligible, are we potentially under litigation from a school district that would have been eligible but doesn't get funding?
I think that's a reasonable risk.
Yeah. Do you mean eligible today, or was eligible?
Eligible today. If we award based on eligibility that we thought it was eligible, but it's not technically eligible today, aren't we at risk of litigation?
I think we're at risk of litigation no
One
matter
thing
what we
that
do.
that I would note is that if the board were to adopt option 2, it's consistent with the way the program has worked in the past. Basically, all the applications at the time of submittal are required to update eligibility. Basically, enrollment information at the time of submittal. That's the way the application has been processed since 1998.
I think, though, that there was never such a long gap in bond measures. That's the conundrum we find ourselves in here, is that the program itself has not changed. There just has been a lot of time that passed between funds being available. So that, Senator Nguyen.
May I make a suggestion, combining the 1 and the 2, and help me, and I'm going to try this. So what we would do is that those applications that were submitted and construction is already underway or are done will be grandfathered in. Those who have submitted but has not started construction or has not completed construction would then have to do a streamlined process of self-certification of their eligibility. That way you kind of separate the two projects. One is if you're under construction, we're not going to penalize you. Let's move forward. Let's get your grandfather you in.
Okay.
The other one would be is if you have submitted, because we haven't processed it and it's been about 5 years, you need to do a self-certification of your eligibility today. And if you are eligible today, then we move forward with you. And if you're not, then we're sorry. We go to the next new application. I think that kind of gives you a sweet spot of both.
I have Mr. Nazarian and then Senator Pam. Yes.
So before your question is answered, I was actually going to ask this. I don't know if it helps your question or not, but just so we're clear about what we're talking, the groups we're talking about. The first group, that was from June to November of 2012, that the vetting has completely been done
That's the trusted unfunded
and is
list.
ready to go.
It's done.
We're not talking.
We're not
talking about
talking about that, right?
Talking about the acknowledged list.
So the acknowledged list from 2012 until whenever it was that we've been gathering the list up until last year. How much time did we spend on each of these applications?
None.
Zero.
But, yeah,
Okay.
Just a quick fact check, just a quick, is it here or is it not? So less than 5 minutes.
Components for that, right?
The components, yeah.
Components.
We have not reviewed at all. So self-certification, we would not, potentially, we would not be reviewing the eligibility at all.
So I don't really see how option 1 isn't really the only option for us left to move forward. But just my opinion.
Senator Pam.
Well, I think the challenge for that, I'm sorry, is that because the time lapse has been so long and it's uncommon for us, that a lot of these projects have moved forward. I shouldn't say a lot. I don't even know. Okay, it's 298 projects. I don't know which one it is or not. And so some of them have used their local bonds and hoping that maybe when the state bond gets there, if we have a state bond, then they will be eligible. So
Right, but it
some of
doesn't-
them have already been under construction, and so it's really unfortunate that we do now penalize them for trying to be efficient. Because I mean, at the end of the day, and here's a challenge I have having 2 young children. One that's actually in kindergarten, is that by the time we finish construction of say anything in my area, my kids are out. They're in high school by then. And they're gone and graduating. And that's kind of what we shouldn't be doing, is that good for these school districts who have tried to move forward, even though state isn't unsure, but they've moved forward with some of these projects. And I mean, they've been sitting on 5+ years now. And if they waited and they needed the school capacity, we would be yelling at them for not building. And so I don't think that we should penalize those who already went under construction. I think that we should go forward, those who were, who submitted, went under construction, let's move forward, grandfather them in. Those who submitted have not started construction, they need to be recertified, but they need to do self-certification, basically, or find a streamlined process that doesn't put too much pressure on our own staff, because there's a lot of applications going through, or on theirs. And the cost doesn't go too extensive for the local folks as well. So I think if you do it that way, you don't penalize those who really have tried 5 years ago to get their capacity in and not have these portable potties and these, unmet places for these children. Don't penalize them for no reason. I think if you merge both of those in, I think you get a sweet spot of both. And again, we don't even know what those projects, it could be 80% of them, it could be 2. We don't know it because we've stopped processing them.
Senator Penn.
So first of all, just to go back, we didn't process them because there was no bond funding, and we explicitly stated very clearly that given the fact there was no bond funding, there's no assurances. You decide to do this, you decide to do it on your own. Okay. So that's number one. That was very clearly stated. Number two, this is taxpayer money. I mean, it's a bond, but it's the general fund that's paying off the bond, right? And so there has to be some at least minimal level of oversight, right? So to that degree, I'm not sure we can just go and simply say, well, if you started construction on your own, which we've clearly said that we're just going to automatically hand you the money. I mean, there's got to be at least some minimal review of the data to say that you met criteria that we have, standardized criteria we had, even if it's at the time of submission, right, that we decided that you meet the eligibility. Because I think we are putting ourselves at risk if it turns out someone wasn't actually eligible. And there's going to be, I hate to say it, the bond is not so large to meet all of our school construction needs, unless anyone wants to disagree with me there. So there's going to be school districts that at some point this money's going to run out and going to say, well, wait a minute, there's some school districts that didn't meet eligibility. They got funded, and then yet I was going to be next and I didn't because the money ran out. And they would have a point to that. So I do think that there's got to be we can't just simply say, we just grandfather you in and we just automatically hand over the check. I think there's got to be some minimal, at least some review to say that you do meet eligibility. I mean, that's why, otherwise we might as well not have eligibility criteria. Just go ahead and let people ask, put a request for money, fill out a form, and we just hand it over. Because, I mean, even you point out when you actually review the documents, even though they're sort of, and I think everyone's trying to do it in good faith. I don't think anyone's trying to cheat the state or anything, but you find discrepancies, issues, and so forth. And while some people may call that bureaucracy, and believe me, I'm a physician, I have to deal with Medi-Cal and fill out lots of forms, and I like to see fewer of them. There's got to be at least some standard to say that this means you meet the eligibility, you don't, because that's fairness not just to that person, it's to everybody who wants to apply to this pool of money, because unfortunately it's not large enough to cover everything. So I do think there's got to be at least some, I'd like to see what we can try to do to streamline it, make it simpler, minimize, et cetera, and same with people going forward. But I'm not sure I can just say, I can be comfortable with simply, if you decide to spend your own money, we're just going to write you a check for a certain portion of it without doing any kind of review to be sure you meet eligibility, some criteria, program criteria.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz and then Mr. Morales.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with Dr. Pan, Senator Pan, his comments. Kind of reminds me of the conversations that this body had, and I'm talking about the legislature, when they were trying to put another bond on the ballot, and when we, as the Allocation Board, were having a conversation on the unfunded list and receiving applications or the acknowledged list to try to figure out what to do next. And I do recall the flurry of activity of applications coming in from school districts because the legislature was looking to put another bond on the ballot and having very deep conversations with the governor's office and between both houses. What that created also was this sort of perception that the more applications that came in to the State Allocation Board created the perception of a greater need that was out there. And I think that because I do remember that you have to be very careful not to reestablish the eligibility, because a lot of it was based on the opportunities basically of having the program stay very similar, if not identical, and then have those applications then basically be processed and sussed out basically to review the eligibility as they move forward. I think that if you don't use option one, you're going to see a lot of those partially get approved when the eligibility wasn't accurate. I also think that there's going to be basically a minimal amount. Some will actually see their ground amounts go a little bit fluctuate, maybe take a small hit here or there. But I think it's the best option for staff, resources, and time to be able to review them based on the criteria that they have in front of them. I think it's the most beneficial one because it avoids all the unnecessary basically scenarios. I think Senator Nguyen is right. There might be some, there might be a lot, there might be none, right? But given that criteria that a lot of it was just basically, for a lot of show, to show that there was a need, I think we should demonstrate that there actually are accountable for the eligibility that they put forward.
Mr. Morales?
Just to clarify, and this is really a processing, regardless if it's option 1 or 2, the projects will have to be reviewed. And enrollment projections will be reviewed. The question is whether it's at the time, the enrollment projects at the time of submittal or at the time of review. And if we come up with something in between, but they will have to be reviewed. They will have to have eligibility to be able to get funded. So it's not a question of not processing it, and staff, please correct me if I'm wrong. The option 1, option 2 will be processed. It's just a matter of which enrollment numbers to use.
Those are the differences between option 1 and option 2. And option 1 and option 2, we anticipated fully processing the applications, just depending on which year for the enrollment.
Can I ask a question? I'm confused here. So if it's at the time of submittal, or it's at the time of the review, we could answer that today, though. We don't need to have you go through and review all these projects, right?
That's correct.
That's option 2. That's option 2.
Okay.
Option 1 would be recheck eligibility.
And base it on today's numbers,
Today's
essentially.
numbers, that's correct.
So again,
That's the difference.
we're just telling all these districts that submitted with their projections that you're out of luck. You might have built something. You played by the rules even. Your numbers were consistent with reality then,
Well, I don't-
and you're not, hold on, and you're not going to get the funds back.
But I don't know if we know that yet. I mean, we can ask districts to reestablish their eligibility.
Well, it doesn't, so if we do know it, what does it change?
Is it all helpful to say, the baseline of the conversation here is, do we want to know eligibility based on current enrollment projections or enrollment projections at the time the application was submitted, which could have been 2010? That's the fundamental question between option 1 and 2.
That's the fundamental question the board has to make, right?
Yes, the processing.
So the question really is, are we going to leave districts out in the wind and not fund their projects they've built in the past? Or are we going to rebench it and say, today, going forward, we're going to use new numbers?
And that's my recommendation, is you kind of
Right.
separate them. So those who submitted and constructed
Yes.
should be grandfather in.
Yeah.
Those who
Not a guarantee that
not a guarantee.
Right.
Obviously, they have to go through the process.
Yeah.
Now, those who have submitted but hasn't constructed, they have to immediately do their certification or re-eligibility for today's projection. Yeah, because they're going to build with the money to go forward, but using, of course, a streamlined process such as self-eligibility, and so that the process would be shorter and faster among themselves, and that they don't also have to.
Why
encompass
even
so much
shorter
work.
and faster? I don't know that changes anything. Because it's just really, we're just picking the date. Of what point we're going to
But the
bench them off,
gentleman
correct?
from his school district stated that although it's a one-piece application, but to have all the documentation to justify it or to show evidence of the increase in enrollment is quite extensive. So it's not just the application that we have, it's the backup documents that is pretty extensive for the school district.
Right. So if you've gone through before, you submitted eligibility
Correct.
information before, we're just going to make the self-certification easy, assuming that you meet eligibility.
But why?
Because you've already, for precisely the reasons you were describing before, these are folks who applied in good faith, wanted, they were eligible for the projects before, the money wasn't available.
Right. So they built their project.
Sorry?
They built their project.
Well, if they already built their project under her proposal, those folks are going to be grandfathered and they're going to be covered.
Correct.
For those that haven't built their projects, who haven't started construction, she's going to want to allow for a streamlined self-certification to show that you're continuing to be eligible.
Yes.
Can I just say, I cannot support an acknowledgement here that we're proposing to fund schools where there is no eligibility currently. So that is, I mean, we would be acknowledging that we're processing an application for apportionment at a later date for a school that I don't, it doesn't even matter if it's built or not built, that there is no eligibility for. I don't know how we justify that when we're talking about projects that would be lower on the list with a clear eligibility for the need right now. So I don't know if there would, they could reapply next year if their eligibility, I'm not familiar with how quickly the eligibility is updated. But
Help me understand what you're saying,
They would
though.
always be able to come back if there were bond funds available. But
Help me understand that, though. So you're saying if a project was built 4 years ago based on, they were eligible 4 years ago.
Yes,
What
but
you're
there was no
saying,
money.
right? But there was no money. What you're saying is they're out.
they are, yes, they have no eligibility. They have no program.
Even though at the time they built their project, they were eligible.
And let's remember that their board submitted an application with a document that said, I understand as a board that I'm submitting an application with no guarantee of funding approval, no guarantee of what kind of program might exist in the future. It's not as if we have those applications in-house with everyone having a guarantee of funding. We have those applications in-house simply because the board said people could keep sending them, even though there was no money available. So the program eligibility for me, as one vote, is kind of a threshold matter. I don't see how we can legitimately approve a process where we are approving projects where there is no eligibility. Now, the trick here is we don't know to the extent this is even a problem. We're still back at that issue that we don't really know. We could certainly move forward with option one, and any school that was determined ineligible, I would assume they would appeal that decision by staff to the board. The first time that it happened, the board could consider the consequences of that, whether there are extenuating circumstances. We may be deciding these issues on a case-by-case basis, but I don't know how we have a blanket policy that says.
So how about if we were to make a motion that we move forward with, let's say, option one, but if there are impacted schools, thank you. If there are impacted schools, they receive first hearing or first priority so that they're not losing any opportunity.
That's option two, isn't it?
They can appeal it.
No.
But we
No.
make the decision.
Yeah, because
So basically,
Exactly. It
to
comes back
allow
to
them
us
to have an
anyway.
appeal process, right?
Yeah.
If you do option one, what the assemblyman is saying is to have an appeal process so that they can then come forward to us if they're not eligible or if they already went under construction.
I think that's what it already does anyway. That's why I thought option one is the best way to go. Because then it allows us to case by case determine. But if we want to be more specific and say that also, we can do that as well. Am I
Yeah,
getting the wrong
motion
information?
could be specific that we will see any application that would be kicked out because of an eligibility issue, that we would see that, at the next available board meeting to have that consideration.
So if we're ready, I'm
And then-
happy to
and-
just
and-
entertain the motion and say,
Madam Chair, may I?
Hold on one second. We do have many speakers on this issue and on the grant agreement issue. So I do want to try to close out the conversation on the processing of the acknowledged list. So let's try to do that and see if there's anybody. Most of the speakers are on the grant agreement. Mr. Duffy.
Well, Madam Chair, Tom Duffy for the Coalition for Adequate School Housing, and thank you very much. I'll fill out one of your forms. In listening to your discussion, what I think I'm compelled to tell you is the regulation that you adopted in 2012 did not change the law, and of course you can't change the law. What you did, and we argued against the board doing it at the time, was to try to differentiate between projects that your prior reg that said you have met all of our requirements and we've processed you. Now we want to tell you we're not going to process you, but you could not deny districts from applying according to the statute. And so OPSC had to receive them and recognize that they indeed met all the qualifications of the law. In meeting all the qualifications of the law at that time, you, in our view, must accept that information. The fact that you couldn't fund them wasn't the district's fault. The district spent money according to the program, to get to that place in line. They had to spend a good deal of money to get to that place in line to be reviewed and under that threshold of meeting the requirements of the law. So it is difficult for us to even look at something beyond option 2. But it appeared to me that you were trying to do something that was maybe reasonable by saying who went beyond and spent their money getting to this eligibility for the program and going beyond and even building. So what you're basically saying, and forgive me for this, but
Can I interrupt for one
yes.
second? Do you agree that the board that submitted an application and spent money to submit an application sent also an acknowledgement that there was no guarantee that they would get a project funded?
But that acknowledgement, it didn't contravene their ability to be in the program and stay in the program.
But you're making an argument that they spent money to get on a waiting list, but they knew that there wasn't any money and that they had no guarantee that a bond would pass in the future and no guarantee of what the program would be in the future. So
And we've been in that same circumstance many times before, but we didn't know in 2012 that we wouldn't have a bond until 2016. We didn't know in 2006 we wouldn't have one. So the program that has worked and worked very well since 1998 has seen the ebb and flow of state dollars and district dollars. And to identify that a school district builds a school based on the rules, based on the law, and maybe there's some declining enrollment because of what happened in California, that doesn't mean that that school isn't needed and that the school district made an error and that their CBO made an error in going forward with this.
I think that's exactly what we would entertain in an appeal.
But what you're doing then is you're further complicating a program that I thought the administration wanted to simplify. If you went
appeals every month, so I don't think of the appeal.
we know that, and we try to arrange so that those things don't happen. But what I would suggest to you that if you go with option 2, you are going to do, I think, what has been suggested on both sides to try to make sure that we move forward with this program. And if districts have some issue, your talented staff is going to winnow through these, and we know how thorough they are. Those that will not qualify will get weeded out. But if projects have been built and they say, well, gee, we're looking at 2017 as opposed to 2013, I don't believe you can do that under the law. They met the qualifications at that time. Your regulation did not deny any of that. You simply try to divert this. And Mr. Diaz, your comment about, well, districts that didn't apply because we should give them some kind of consideration. The board at that time was trying to dissuade districts from applying, and that's why that was done. That was specifically told to me. We want to dissuade districts. So what I would ask you to do is really consider the fact that districts have spent money that's hard to get at the local level, GO bond money, developer fee money, whatever it is, and allow those projects to be filtered out through whatever the system is, but go with option 2, because I think you are not following the provisions of the law if you say we're going to deny.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to call try to close
I'm
up this
sorry,
conversation.
Madam Chair.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just asked if anecdotally we've even received any complaints from any district, and we haven't heard anything. So how can you be making that accusation?
Well, I don't know if it's an accusation. Maybe it's simply stating, I think, the truth. But there's 1,000 school districts in California. We try to communicate with them all the
Anecdotally,
time.
we have not received any complaምents.
But just because you
Nothing.
haven't received a complaint doesn't mean there's not a
Or
problem.
we haven't heard anything that suggests. That's why I'm trying to figure out where's.
And maybe-
Why not just go through this
maybe-
process
maybe
and
there
see?
isn't an issue if you went with option 2, Assemblymember, because I'm sorry. Maybe there is not an issue, but it's very difficult if you're running a school district. I ran a school district for 12 years. You have trouble going beyond just taking care of the needs and the teachers in your community. So reaching into this program takes extraordinary effort. And it may be that districts just aren't aware of all the things that are going on. So again, and I apologize if I sounded like I was being accusatory. What I was trying to do was state what I think is the reality in the law.
Madam Chair, I think there was a motion on the table. I'd like to second that motion by Assemblymember Nazarian. If you would like to repeat the motion to follow option 1 with the process, if you would like to explain on appeal.
I think
With
you got it right.
explicit direction to make sure that those projects that might be ineligible because of the eligibility requirements would come to us on appeal.
Yes.
At the next available meeting. So we'll take comment from the board members, and then what I want to do is ask if there is any public comment on this acknowledge list processing question. We'll save the grant agreement public comment next. Come on up. Senator Nguyen, did you have a comment?
I was actually ready to support option 2. I would like to do a blend, as mentioned. I just, I mean, they're still going to have to go through the process, but I just don't want us to, I mean, we don't know what the number is, and you're talking. I mean, I have no problem with having these groups come up and and have to appeal to us. But I would tell you, I mean, I've been to this board meeting once last year, and when you're talking about appealing to this board, you're now bringing the school district, the teachers, the students. I mean, it's a full process for these school districts. They're not something that they take lightly, and as you know, that appealing to any government agency is not something that is easy either. So I'm not sure if we go through with just purely option 1 and allowing everybody to appeal is the right. If you're going to do that, then you're going to have to be more specific to staff to allow them to, what is appeal, what they're appealing, what's not. Because I think you're asking for something larger than what we are anticipating or want. And then I respect Madam Chair's view of not wanting to support it sounds like option 2, but staff didn't. I'm going to assume that staff didn't put option 2 in there, knowing that it's not legally allowed. So I think that the option staff has given has most likely been vetted in what we can and cannot do. So I'm going to err on the side of that staff has already went through that process and just trying to get direction from us. So I wouldn't say that option 2 or grandfathering folks in is somehow not legally sound.
Okay. Any other board comments? Okay.
I'm sorry. I just have one comment. Again, I'm trying to think from the perspective of a school district. If I'm on the acknowledged list, knowing that I have no guarantee of funding, I'm not going to go forward with a project that's going to be in the tens of millions of dollars without knowing that I have some fund source. So I'm going to have a local bond issued. Right? I'm not going to start construction without that. So then there's the larger policy issue of, for the limited funds that we have available for a bond, do we want to see those monies go to a project that isn't eligible under the current rules, but that's already been constructed, possibly for a school district that already has local bond funds to pay for those things? Or do we want to see those monies go to a school district that maybe never had the opportunity to apply because they didn't have the resources and knew they couldn't issue a local bond and now are eligible because of increasing enrollment? So that's a policy question. And I would propose that we would want to fund the school districts that are largely socioeconomically disadvantaged, that don't have the opportunity to issue local bonds, and have those schools get the funds. Thank you.
I just have to add to that, though, because conversely, why would we have such a program wherein they could apply? Right? I think there was some expectation that the program would continue, so it's time to continue the program, and we're going to say, well, actually, you applied. We had a program where you could apply. There was infrastructure where you could apply that was associated with this board, and today we're going to say, well, we're just going to start over today. That's really what we're saying from my perspective.
I'm sorry, maybe maybe I was misinterpreted. I think the larger issue for me is that if these school districts that were on the acknowledged list, they bet on the come, they didn't get the funds, they probably have local funds to pay for these schools or the construction, which frees up additional funds for school districts that may not have had the ability to do local funds, still do not have the ability to do local bonds, and they can build more schools.
I don't know that they bet as much as they banked on a program that exists at the state level, but that's enough.
It's only the eligibility that we're talking about here. We're not saying that we're rejecting the application and the entire list of applications. We're just talking about requiring an update of the eligibility. So I think we are very much honoring the spirit of the past board action that allowed the applications to come through. Otherwise, we would be looking at option 3. So I'm going to go to our public comment. If you could be brief, because we have talked about this for a long time, and only focus on the motion at hand. You can come back up to talk about the grant agreement. So we'll start here.
Thank you, Madam Madam Chair. My name's Alana Cunningham, and I'm from Jack Schrader's office. We're a school facility consulting firm, and we work with a number of small school districts, as well as other districts throughout the state. And when you ask the question how reestablishing new construction will affect districts, I think the answer is for small districts, it's uncertain, because small school districts that are locked under 2,500 students are locked for 3 years. So the issue of how that lock will work for small districts who submitted, say, funding applications in 14-15 and eligibility in 14-15, how the eligibility will be processed for those districts. Because they're locked for 3 years from the SAB approval date. The SAB has not been approving eligibility. So the question is, when does that lock happen for these districts? So the answer for the small districts is that clarification hasn't been provided, so we're uncertain at this time how it will impact the small districts.
Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor. Madam Chairman Ortega. My name is Julie Arthur. I'm with Palm Springs Unified School District. I'm the Executive Director of Facilities there, of Design and Planning. And I did want to speak on the acknowledged list. I have about 9 projects on the acknowledged list. And I just wanted to actually speak to, we're talking about eligibility. So eligibility really is a snapshot in time for any project. So if 10 years ago where there was bond funding, I may have had eligibility for a new school with 2,500 students. I may not have that today. I built that school. That school has changed. My district size is 500 square miles. So I have possibly need for a school in Desert Hot Springs where I don't have it in Palm Springs now. So I don't think what we're looking at with the growth issue here is about a project that shouldn't be built or not built or funded. What we're looking at, a difference of eligibility, is numbers of students. So if I submitted a project in 2012, I may have had eligibility for elementary school of 900 students. Most districts down in Southern California have gone down. My eligibility may only be 700 now if I had to resubmit today. Well, what does that 200 students mean to me? It still means I need a school. But for every classroom I don't get of those 25 students per classroom, costs me $300,000 in grant funds. So I think that's really what we're talking about here, is why it's important to keep the eligibility at the time of submittal. That was the need, that was the design that I built on. That was the project that went through DSA and received approval. That was the project that went through CDE and received approval. That's the project that I submitted when I submitted my 5001, my 5002, my 5003, and submitted my 5004 at that time. So even though I went through and did that, what's happened with those on the acknowledged list is they haven't had the plan review team actually work on those now. So my submittal on time of those projects was the snapshot I had, which may cost me millions of going down. I still need the school, but I lose funds on what I built. And it doesn't mean that I don't need a classroom. It means I may have 3 less students in each grade level. So that's the balance of how things move out where you're losing funds on it. I think that's what's important on the acknowledged list.
That is helpful. I think that is helpful. I think the issue, though, is should that $300,000 per classroom go to another project where the eligibility is more pressing? I mean, for me, that's the trade-off we're making. So I think that is actually very helpful. Appreciate the comments.
So, and again, I was going to ask, I really wanted to put out that, again, the date order is equitable. It's something that school district personnel has worked with for 10, 12, 15 years, and realize that most school districts have seen Measure 51 language for 18 months. We saw what went on the ballot when we went out and got signatures back in the summer of 2015. We got signatures, we saw the ballot language. when it passed in November 16, we saw the ballot language. We knew what the program was. So in responding to the kind of betting on that wouldn't be a program, I think we all saw what the program would be for the last 18 months. And I think that's why it's important to keep the date order in place.
Option one does that, correct?
On the acknowledged list.
Yes.
But also at the same time, it keeps you in order on it, but you may be losing money if you take the new eligibility on the growth projects.
Sure. Thank you. Okay.
Madam Chair, members, Nancy Chaitis Espinosa. Thank you. Nancy Chaitis Espinosa on behalf of the California School Boards Association. I'd like to just shed some light on a couple of the questions that keep coming back on the board's discussion. So the first is why hasn't staff heard from districts saying specifically that they will be caught in the situation where they will be affected detrimentally if they have to use today's eligibility numbers? And the reason for that actually goes back to something that Mr. Pierce on behalf of Elk Grove Unified said. Calculating your eligibility is not something that most districts can do unless they have to do. So it's technically complex, it's time intensive and labor intensive and requires some cost. So it's not something that most districts in the state would be able to do just to satisfy your curiosity or to participate in this process. So that's why instead of being deluged with phone calls, the board is hearing from California School Boards Association and CASH and statewide representatives like that. So just wanted to shed some light on that. Second question that keeps coming back to the board is why would a local school board bet on a reimbursement? Why would you expect that money to come? And of course, you're right, we signed those disclosures in order to get in line. But I also want to encourage you in the direction in which you're going, where you're stepping back and trying to think about the overall message that you might be sending. Because part of that is, as a local governing board member, and full disclosure, I represent Elk Grove Unified School District, which Mr. Pierce spoke on behalf of. Today I'm wearing my CSBA hat. We are hearing loud and clear of what the administration, what the board wants to see, and what prior boards have said. For example, in 2014, there was an attempt to revamp this program, and the proposal that we understood was supported by the administration would have ranked school districts in order of their bonded indebtedness. So the message to us consistently has been, be flexible, be creative. If you can raise revenue locally, go ahead and do that. So we have done that. So I do find that it frankly would penalize us now to do option one or to require new eligibility as opposed to the eligibility at the time of submittal, because these districts have gone ahead and used all the flexibility at their disposal to meet local need. So is it fair? Is it worthwhile? Absolutely, because these governing boards move forward in good faith, and they were expecting this program to be consistent with past practice. So if generally speaking, for grant programs and construction in particular, it's viewed as a good thing to fund projects that are, quote, shovel-ready, I don't see why this program would need to be an exception, particularly when we can achieve that while maintaining accountability and transparency. So I would encourage you to support option two.
Thank you. We have two more here.
I'll go first. So, good afternoon, Madam Chairman, board members. My name is Alan Rising. I'm the Executive Director of Facilities for Long Beach Unified School District. Thank you for the opportunity to come up and speak with you today and address some very important topics that we're presenting today. Long Beach Unified is a large urban school district in Southern California. We currently serve about 75,000 students at 85 different school sites in the communities of Long Beach, Lakewood, Signal Hill, and Catalina Island. In 2016, just trying to address the concept of need, 2016 we updated our facilities master plan, which showed a funding shortfall in excess of $1.5 billion for our schools. Those are projects, those are needs at every school site that go unmet on a daily basis. So we currently, in Long Beach, we have 10 applications on the acknowledged list that total in excess of $71 million. Though 8 of those projects have already been completed and are occupied, there are 2 more that will be done by the time of early 2018. They're currently under construction. Each of these projects represent high priority critical needs that our school district had at the time. We elected to move forward with these projects because these were critical needs to the students of our district. We actually elected to move monies from other available sources that we had in order to meet those needs of our students and our staff of our school district. Speaking a little bit to Mr. Kim's concept about the foolishness of actually doing a project without knowing that we have money, it's important to remember that these projects have been critically needed for many, many years. School districts have been continuously underfunded for their facilities, and the needs needed to be met. We had students that were unhoused. We had portables that were rampant around our district. So I believe that our board and our school district made wise decisions to use the available flexibility and the available money they had to move forward, with the understanding and the expectations that at a future date when bond proceeds became available, that we had a partnership with this body, that you would provide the support at the state level to help us with meeting those needs. That $71 million will go a long ways to meeting the critical needs of students in other areas of our school district. As far as districts that may potentially be harmed with new construction, several of those projects on the list are for new construction. We have been going through an era of declining enrollment. Although I have not, because of the complexity of the effort, I have not updated my eligibility, so I couldn't tell you factually. It would not surprise me if one or more of those projects, in fact, had some challenges with eligibility. But I do beg you to consider the decisions that my board and my district was under at the time that we made a decision to move forward. These are very, very real needs for students that we had to meet at that time. And we very much expected that we would have a partnership with this committee or this board moving forward to be able to provide the funding for that. So this is a critical need for our district. I'll limit some of the comments, but just to say, as far as the acknowledged list, we do appreciate the ideas that have been discussed here. We beg the board to support the amended option 2, where projects that have been in construction or have been completed will be moved forward grandfathering in using the enrollment data that was being used at that time. Projects that have not been constructed, we could see that there would be definitely a need to relook at your enrollment data to see if it's still a wise decision to move forward. But don't penalize school districts for using all available tools and all available resources at their disposal to meet kids' needs. I think Senator Wynn had mentioned that her students were suffering through some of these needs now. And districts recognize that. We recognize that we have real students in real classrooms today that we need to meet. And we every day struggle with identifying critical needs and finding ways to meet those on a daily basis. So we are recommending that you adopt an amended option 2 moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rise. I just wanted to clarify one thing. I in no way meant to suggest that I thought that schools were being imprudent by going ahead with the school construction. In fact, it was just the reverse. My point was that I thought school officials were prudent enough to know that they had a local fund source to cover those construction costs in the absence of state funding. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Thank you for that. But again, the point being is that those needs existed clearly at that time. And so 5, 6 years later, 7 years later, to say that there has been a change in those data points and that now we would not be eligible to receive that money. The other point I wanted to make is that these are real, tangible, long-term investments in the state, in our infrastructure. So although today we may argue that I might be 3 students down in a particular classroom, those students will come back. We have shown time and time again in our demographics that these schools are investments in the future of our students and the children of the state. So it's not money ill spent.
Senator Penn?
Just a brief question. So in the time which we had no bond, school district went ahead, got a local bond, built construction, and I don't want to imply in any way that we don't want the state to be a partner, but you did decide to fully fund it on your local bond or whatever arrangement you made. So now that you coming back to the state and saying, because I assume that you fully funded it with whatever financial arrangement you made, and no, I mean, at that point, there was no Prop 51, no expectation. So now that state's coming in and paying a certain portion of that, what happens to those funds that you raised with that bond locally? Do you just give that back to the voters? Do you build another construction? What happens?
No,
That money.
those, as I had stated earlier, we have clearly identified $1.5 billion in unmet need in our district. So those monies where we actually, quote, borrowed from another project. So we have projects that now are not moving forward because
So
of
that
the-
would be reinvested in other.
it would be reinvested in other high priority critical needs for our school district.
Okay, which of course you then want to be in line to get more money from us, correct? Which would be appropriate, right?
Depending on the eligibility, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So when 2012, whenever these projects were built, you went ahead and took funds from one place and then put them into the project, and then you at the same time, or somewhat before, you applied at the state, right?
Yeah,
To this body, because there was an expectation that we were going to participate in that venture. And in fact, a formal process has been set up so that you could eventually participate with the state. Is that correct?
Yes,
Thank
absolutely.
you.
Yes.
But when you when you began construction, those projects were eligible at the time.
Yes, they were.
Okay. And you had to certify that when you applied?
We submitted all those documents to the Office of Public School Construction at that time.
Okay.
Can I answer that?
Yeah.
I've made a comment all night.
Well, thank you.
But if we go with what's being on the floor right now, option one, if you were at risk, you can still appeal to this board to get your money. Is that my understanding?
Correct.
Right. They can come back and appeal. Right.
Yes, that's Mr. Nazarian's motion.
Right.
Yeah,
So do you have a problem with what?
Well, I just think in speaking to the concept of complexity, it does leave a level of uncertainty at the district's level, and it adds an extra level of complexity. So now we're coming back to this body to adopt exceptions to the rule as we're moving forward. We think that there's a simpler and more elegant solution of picking a date, and maybe that's today's date, maybe it's July 1st, on when projects have been in construction or have been awarded or have been completed, that those projects would be grandfathered in. Projects beyond that date, we could go back and we could recertify that eligibility.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon. Darren Waters. I'm the Deputy Superintendent for Valverde Unified School District in Riverside County. Thank you for your time today. Appreciate it. A real example for us, 83% free and reduced lunch, high poverty area. We have a lot of assessed valuation challenges, as you can imagine, from that type of poverty. Our community stepped up and approved a bond, a GO bond, which I can't get to the money now because the AV is so low. We had a need. We certified our eligibility at the time. We needed a new high school. Have to house the kids, much like my colleagues. So we've gone forward. We're building a high school in phases. I've finished phase 1. I got 9th and 10th graders in there. Phase 2 is just about done. Phase 3, I've got to have done by August because I got to have the kids come in for the junior class. The senior class comes in. I don't have any place to go for this. This was part of the discussions we had. We followed along with the program. We did what we were supposed to do. We submitted our eligibility. I honestly do not know today what my eligibility is. I could be fine on this. I don't know. But as Ellen pointed out, there's a cost associated with that. And I wasn't going to update my eligibility because I didn't need another school right now. If we needed another school, we'd certainly be pursuing that. I would really encourage you. I'm not sure there's a difference between the option compromise presented by Senator Wynn and option 1 with the appeal, with the exception of certainty. Why would we why would we want to have another step in there of an appeal process? I mean, and I would never want to say that it would be. I don't know how you would deal with those at that time. Would it be I don't like the term rubber stamp, but are they going to automatically be approved? Is there certainty that you can provide to the locals that need to get these funds so that we can build our next projects and finish the ones we're in currently? So I'd really encourage you to look at that.
I would prefer the appeal route because we don't really know what's before us. The unknown of how many are going to fall into this category, what's the circumstances of why they built at the time, and how much their eligibility has declined, these sorts of things. That's the reason why the appeal process makes more sense to me.
But
I respect and acknowledge the uncertainty question. You know, Prop 51 did not grandfather in all the applications. That would have been the way to get certainty if the initiative had said all the lists are approved as they were submitted. That isn't there, and so not knowing what we'd be agreeing to with, respectfully with Senator Wynn's proposed amendment, not knowing what that really means is why I would be uncomfortable supporting that route. Senator Allen, did you have?
What do you mean?
Not knowing how many projects may not have eligibility that have already newly constructed that would then be allowed to move forward.
Should we get some? Is there a way?
Well, the problem is we can't get the information until the applications are processed, and so that's why letting them start the processing of the applications, and then when the first one, when it occurs, bringing that forward, and maybe then, and maybe after it happens, we get a sense of the complexities, why they built. Is it a compelling case? I mean, maybe at that point we have some sense of having a broader policy, but I feel like at this point we just don't know what that might be. Are there any more public comments on this question? Okay. Shall we move back to the grant agreement and the rest of our public comment on that question? Okay. Well, we are going to we're going to need to have two votes. We have this issue and we have the grant agreement. So should we quickly move through the public comment on the?
Is the Alameda thing?
No, the
we're-
grant agreement is.
The entire thing's item 7, correct?
Yes. So we had a motion, but your motion was only to the issue of the eligibility. So moving back to the approval of the grant agreement and the requirements that Lisa laid out. Remind us what page they are on, if you
We're on
would.
page,
Well, this is kind of important, though. I don't want to move too fast.
on page 84.
Page 84.
Is the grant agreement.
So we had a presentation on that, but we had just opened the public comment.
Right, and we acknowledged that we wanted to modify the grant agreement to incorporate several
Right.
modifications.
We had the technical changes on the freezer and the refrigerator. We had the revised staff recommendation to exclude the $370 million in true unfunded projects from the list. It would apply to the balance of the acknowledged list.
And also acknowledge that we would modify the grant agreement to acknowledge the advisory letters that are.
Yes, the grant
Produced,
agreement would
right.
make clear that if you got advice from OPSC on an item, that
That
you
we
could
would
provide
amend
that
that
to the
to
auditor.
reflect that on the various pages, yes, and adopt the regulations.
Yes. It's all in the page 84. Recommendations are all listed on page 84. Correct, Lisa? Is
Yes.
that right? So should we quickly move through the public comment on, is that fine with everyone, or did anyone have any comments? Okay, so.
I'm confused as to the motion. Is the motion for
We-
move item 7? Are you,
There's separate action items in tab 7.
Okay.
One of them is a grant agreement, is what we started off initially, and then we folded it into the acknowledged list.
So I'll call a couple of speakers up, Kirk Nicholas and Julie Arthur. This again would be on comments related to the grant agreement, as we've already heard the comments on the processing of the acknowledged list. And again, I'll ask you to be brief. Do we have Julie Arthur? She maybe has, oh, you can come back up. And Eric Bakke would be next. Please.
So, Madam Chair, board members, thank you for letting me speak this early evening. I'm here, I'm the superintendent of Lambersville Unified. It's not as big as Long Beach and some of the other districts. We reside between Livermore and Tracy. We're the highest performing school district in San Joaquin County and in a master plan community. I'm here with a very simple plea, which is that we're asking that the State Allocation Board approve the release of funds, or to bring the funds in on the unfunded list. In a master plan community, you have to build a school every 3 years. We've done everything humanly possible to keep building up with the size of the growth. We'll be breaking ground on a school this month, and we're already planning for the next school beyond that. And we currently have a unfunded list K-8 school that has not been funded for years. The release of those funds would bring that money into our district. Concurrently, we're also building a state-of-the-art high school, about a $135 million project. We built in phases similar to what the gentleman before me spoke. For us, the bottom line is that having funds out there that Prop 51 can cover, to have this board approve it, have that money come in, would allow us to fulfill our promise through the resolution list on the bond, not put so much pressure on our general obligation bond, but also continue the process of a rapidly growing community, building schools every 3 years.
Thank you. Julie?
Hi, good evening again. Julie Arthur, Palm Springs Unified School District. First of all, I'd like to thank staff today for proposing to remove the words "only if used to provide food service to the student population" on that. Refrigeration and freezers are big in the desert. We have a lot of special ed programs where we have to have refrigeration for medication. We actually have to have refrigeration in our staff lounge as well. Insulin, all kinds of different medications that we need. So I really appreciate you taking that out. It was a big concern to us on that. And I would like to, again, bring up the point about technology. It really is the computers. I know we look at the frame of a computer, we're saying it's only 3 years, but in reality, we use our computers much more than 3 years. They go from everywhere from our career tech programs and from soundboards to all kinds of different things to our energy management for our school sites in making sure that's how we control our temperatures there and saving. And we're not really able to use many of the items that are eligible, like projectors, without these computers. So it's very similar if, and again, because we're a little warm, it was 109 yesterday, so we put air conditioning in, and we put all the ductwork in, right? And we put all this in, and we put these air conditioning units in. And if we did all this stuff, and you didn't let me put the compressor in, the air conditioner wouldn't work. That's kind of how technology computers are to us. We put all the infrastructure into the buildings, we put the wiring in, we bring that in, we put a projector, a smart board up, but without that computer, I can't turn on the air to those technology. So that's why it's something I think in that startup that's so important to be part of it. And it's amazing the changing of our technology. And I would hate to lock us in to keeping the words computer in the ineligible. So I ask if you would please reconsider that again and maybe work with it a little bit. I don't think many schools are abusing it. I hope not. We just finished our audit process of over $230 million worth of projects, and I'm getting a check back for $150,000, so which will go in there. So I feel that many districts, if there's a problem, I think it's out of ignorance, not out of hopefully attempt to do something. So I hope you would look at that again and maybe keep something of the way of how the computer or something with that in the grant agreement. So
Thank you.
thanks.
Mr. Parkey?
Eric Bakke, Los Angeles Unified School District. Thank you for being here. I just want to open up just with a quick thank you to OPSC staff. We've provided, I'd like to say countless recommendations, technical policy considerations, many of which were adopted in this latest revise. We still have some concerns. We expressed some of those with OPSC staff. Actually happy to hear, I was going to raise a few of them today. I was happy to hear some of the comments already made, so that's extremely helpful. I just want to point out, though, that and I think it was brought up, when we look at the eligibility list, what projects are deemed eligible, I think even today we've just learned that there's new items being added to that list today that were added at the last SAB meeting. And I expect there will be more items added to this list, which is what prompted my original statement about not having a defined list. Having a statement of definition of what constitutes an eligibility list. I think that provides greater flexibility. I will backpedal a little bit and say that there's some new added language in this that provides a little bit of flexibility, but I still think we have to recognize that this grant agreement is a binding agreement between OPSC and or the State Allocation Board and the school district, but it's going to be the guiding principle for any auditor that's going to use to determine whether or not projects are eligible or not, or expenditures, I should say. And so we want to make sure that there is flexibility for growth of that list, and that OPSC has the flexibility at their administrative level to make those real-time decisions. What I'm concerned about is that being so specific in a grant agreement, it's in essence a regulation. And so it begs the question if there's the authority to allow for that kind of unilateral decision. So if we can add language to this that provides direction to the auditor, a little bit more specificity that they can communicate or have a conversation with OPSC to determine eligible expenditures, I think would go a long way to help OPSC staff to make determinations. Otherwise, I think where we'll be is where Mr. O'Donnell referenced audit hell, with the EAT process. And I don't think anyone wants to be there. It's one of our biggest concerns is that we'll always be there trying to define what is eligible. I think someone said it's best that it's easier to identify what's ineligible than what is eligible. So just consideration as we go on. The other thing is that this is a new process, and I think we're going to continue to learn as this gets rolled out. So to suggest that this language should be final, I would argue if there's room for this discussion, that we revisit the language. I think there's still a lot of areas that need to be improved upon. It's certainly clarity. For example, there's a reference to savings can only be used for matching share. That was new language that was added in from the last SAB meeting. Now, I understand the intent was to speak to providing direction to the auditor about how savings shall be viewed and looked at. But the way it's drafted in its very simple form, an auditor who doesn't know this program will interpret that the savings can only be used as matching share and not as other high priority capital outlay projects. That's a big problem. So it's things like that, and we've provided some of those that I think we need to look at as we go on, and I would hope and encourage this body to probably bring this item back after we've rolled it out a little bit to see where we can make clarifications where we need to. I'm not necessarily suggesting significant policy shifts, but just clarifications where it's appropriate. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. The next three, Jenny Hanna, Darren Waters, and Letty Boggs. About four more after this. Again, I'm going to remind everyone to please keep it very brief. We're going to lose members and lose the ability to keep our quorum and have votes. So keep it brief and try not to repeat anything that's been said. Thank you. Ms. Hanna.
Good evening. I'm Jenny Hanna. Am I on? Can you hear me? I'm Jenny Hanna. I'm with the Kern High School District in Bakersfield, California, and I won't repeat what I've heard from others. But what I would say first to this board is you have an obligation first to do no harm to these districts. And with that, I mean, we need to be prospective, not retroactive in applying this program. Even if there's one district that could be harmed by this, this can be significant to especially small school districts who large capital projects are, a big hit to their budget. And so with regard to both the previous conversation and the current conversation about grant agreement, I think that's really important to consider. Any of us have a crystal ball, and we do the best that we can with what we have. Also, just a point, I encourage you to act on this, to get going with getting money out on the street. Every day that we wait causes us to lose more ability to get classrooms built at today's dollars. We're seeing escalation now. The longer we wait, the more it's going to cost us to build these schools. So I would encourage you to consider that. Proposition 51 passed over 8 months ago, and we're still talking about how to get this money out on the street. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Waters?
Darren Waters, Valverde Unified. On the grant agreement itself, eligible and ineligible list, I would implore the board to remove the eligible list. The ineligible list makes perfect sense. I have no issue with a list of things we can't buy. I think that gives us the parameters. That tells us what we need to know about the program. The eligible list, the bureaucratic process to get something added to that, I am concerned about. What is that going to take to get something added to that, and what's that process look like? So that would be a big concern of mine. And it still becomes a moving target. We're not getting the certainty we need at the district level. And I'd also implore that we edit the ineligible list to reflect the existing program is applicable from Prop 51 and before, which said the old rules. I mean, and it's back to what Mrs. Arthur said, and that was about computers. That's an integral part, and I understand the bond component of that, but I don't see why we can't issue short-term notes. Why do the bonds have to be 30 years? Why can't we issue shorter-term notes in a small tranche to cover that technology, and therefore we meet that capitalization target piece?
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Boggs?
Yes, I'm Letty Boggs with Colby Technologies, and we have over 100 school district clients. We help them with their budget and then qualifying expenditures against those building program budgets. So we work a lot with our clients on answering calls of what's eligible and not eligible. And one of the things that is a challenge is and to back up, I'm old enough that I remember the program before this program when we had lists. So I kind of am having echoes of, oh my goodness, we're going back to lists where we had to maintain. And one of the primary challenges we had with the lists was consistent application across so that everybody would know. So I really applaud and I'm thank you for listening on the refrigerators and those kinds of things. It's going to be really important that we figure out a mechanism to consistently apply across all of the advice so that districts are treated uniformly in this. One of the things that I would suggest is that we work with some guiding criteria or policy statements. And by way of example, one of the things I tell clients when they call and they say, is this a supply or is this not a supply? That's probably the most confusing area. If you routinely buy it out of your supply budget every year, it is not eligible, ever. And we've been telling people that for 20 years. However, there are many things that get coded to 4310, which is the supply budget, that in the case of a new school are essential equipping of that school as a going concern. And that's where the difficulty occurs. So for instance, if I have a contract and I have window blinds in my construction contract, the kind I specified are no longer available. It's the end of the contract. You don't want to hold that contract open while you go through and order blinds. You change order it out, you go ahead, close the contract. The district will then purchase those blinds. They're not inventoried, so they don't rise to 44 or 6,400, but they certainly are a part of the school building and they are an equipment item. Another different kind of item, but very similar, would be science equipment. When you equip a brand new classroom with every beaker, every microscope, all of the lenses, all of the pipettes, it is in excess of $20,000 per classroom. While individually, they are supply items. But if you're building 4 science labs, you're talking $80,000 at a minimum added to the general fund budget the year you open the school, or you can't really hold class. All of those items are used at some point during every year.
Ms.
The
Vaughn,
routine,
I'm going to ask you to wrap up if you.
the routine budget is for breakage, replacement, loss, not for the full equipping of that lab. So context matters with respect to whether it's a supply item or not, and I would urge you to allow the users, the constituents, to give some input into what things are considered allowable in that essential equipping of the school.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to call the last speakers. Andrea Ball, Alan Rising, I'm not sure, Alan, if you needed to come back up. Nancy Espinosa, again, I'm not sure if you need to come back up. And Lori Ruiz. That's it. And again, I'm going to ask you to be very brief. We're going to lose members and have no votes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members. Andrea Ball with the Ball Frost Group. I'm here on behalf of 2 of our clients, 2 diverse clients, the Association of Suburban School Districts and the Central Valley Education Coalition. Central Valley Education Coalition represents districts in the Central Valley. Small, rural, suburban districts are all over the state. Just to say, to echo the recommendations you've heard from others, so I will be brief on the grant agreement to make it prospective, to make it clear and simple so that small districts have the capacity to complete it successfully. We do want to thank OPSC and the staff for the changes they've announced today. We still think that having an eligible list is not the way to go, to have an ineligible list that's clear, but to have guidance on what is eligible. And I think I'll keep it there, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Thank you. Again, Madam Chair, members, Nancy Chaitis Espinosa on behalf of the California School Boards Association. I too want to echo the previous speaker's comments, and for the sake of time, I won't go through all of the changes I'm grateful for, but I want to express my thanks to staff for hearing the input from stakeholders and for the numerous technical and otherwise changes that they've made to the grant agreement so far. It is very much appreciated. CSBA very much supports the grant agreement and concept we have from the very beginning, and we want to be partners with you in making sure that the system that is created is successful. So all of our comments stem from that. We are concerned about the incorporation of a very large eligible list and a relatively smaller ineligible list. Obviously, the latter should be there for the sake of all of our clarity. Our concern with the large, detailed, eligible list is that it simply doesn't mesh with the way auditors do their work, and we fear that it will create a very complicated system with a greater incidence of things that appear to be negative findings that will either may be resolved or will have to be appealed to the board, but that should have rightfully been allowed in the first place. So that's our concern, and so we would advise that there be a short advisory list of eligible expenditures with a finite list of ineligible expenditures. And I just briefly have to speak to the issue of educational technology. Our understanding of the grant agreement was that it would be a compendium of existing program rules, but this clearly is a pretty significant policy change. And our concern with respect to educational technology is that Proposition 39 actually requires local governing boards to review their educational technology needs in developing their project list. So not only is it allowed, it is required of us. So to have well, I won't say at the administrative level because I understand we're going through emergency regulations, but to use a document such as a grant agreement to conflict with that, to put us in a situation where these things conflict is problematic. So we would respectfully request that the educational technology issue get the benefit of the full discussion of the board so that we can flesh out that issue for you a little bit better.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rising.
So thank you. Again, Alan Rising, Executive Director of Facilities for Long Beach Unified. I'd like to again echo my thanks for staff for addressing a lot of the concerns that have been brought forward related to the grant agreement. But there are a couple of particularly troubling items that I just wanted to make sure I voiced some concerns about. Specifically is the retroactivity concern. Projects that have already been completed, already been in construction or are currently in construction, and applying what essentially amounts to a change of the rules to those projects. It does create somewhat of an imbalance. It does for school districts that in good faith move forward with the understanding of the rules and the allowable expenditures at that time, and then coming back and actually applying a different level of eligible and ineligible projects. We suggest, on the other hand, to actually setting a date similar to the date that we talked about for the acknowledged list, where projects that were awarded before essentially July 1st or another date would not be subject to the grant agreement, much as we did the true unfunded list. Secondly, to quickly talk about this, and you've heard from several other speakers here, the concept of the eligible and ineligible expenditures. We very much think it's much easier and simpler to simply design and produce a list of ineligible expenditures. It's very clear for districts moving forward to know what you cannot spend your money on. Projects are continuously changing and systems are ever evolving as we move forward. They're becoming more complex as we move forward, and having a finite defined list of eligible expenditures seems counterintuitive. We'd rather suggest that we define a list of ineligible expenditures. The board could then address those on a routine basis to see if they needed to be adjusted or amended in some way. But it really lets us know what we're actually moving forward with, and it also lets my auditors know exactly what they're looking for items that would not be eligible to be spent. So relying on appeals to staff members at OPSC just doesn't seem to be a realistic solution. It doesn't seem to be something that can be applied evenly and equitably across the length of the program. Staff members come and go. I know I struggle with that myself. And having a fair and equitable application of exception rules seems to be troubling and be hard to maintain going forward. So thank you very much, and
Thank you.
I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz? And then Mr. Allen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank staff. I think they've done a lot of great work on this issue. Just want to make sure I make known again that they've conceded in several pieces identified by stakeholders in the areas of concern. First of all, the timing of when the agreement must be signed. Now it's a fund release. The entire unfunded list must be exempt from grant agreements. And 3, in the trailer bills, funds used for repayment can come from sources other than the district's general fund and will return the bond accounts. Staff has also stated publicly today and written into this item that they will provide written clarification of any items that are not reflected on the list of eligible and ineligible expenditures. This should satisfy any concerns that districts may have that something was left off and the auditors won't know how to address it. I think I'm ready to move forward on this item. We've kind of beat this item to death, especially since the last meeting that we've had, and we did identify major areas of concern. And we can also remind the board, we can also make several changes in the future to these grant agreements. So I move to approve the staff's grant agreements pursuant to page 84, along with Ms. Silverman's recommendations announced today during her presentation.
Mr. Allen?
Okay, but could I just ask if Mr. Diaz would be willing to take a friendly amendment to respond to some of the concerns that we've raised, which would say that the board, that we would only apply, we'd apply the grant agreement to the acknowledged list only for those projects that have not already been completed or not currently under contract, so that we don't move the goalposts on districts. I would absolutely agree with your motion with that one caveat.
I would say, Senator, that this program hasn't changed, and I think that the grant agreement is just a confirmation that the districts are complying with the existing program. So there's no changing of the goalpost or any of those issues in regards to those items. I think what we're talking about is adherence to a program that we all want to be successful and want to see carry forward. But I will cede to the chair on any of those recommendations.
Just on the moving the goalpost issue, I think that is why after the April meeting, we went back and looked at the issue of the processed applications and why, at least I was supportive and asked staff to bring forward the recommendation that we exempt the processed applications, so the $370 million worth of projects from the grant agreement. The difference, of course, with the acknowledged list is that they are those applications have not been processed. If there was an expenditure that was in the grant agreement, as it's before you today, that the district included in their project, in their application that's on the acknowledged list, there would be time for that district to move that item around, to shift that to a local expenditure and put something else in the state expenditure. So there's no reason why a district needs to feel like this is a gotcha, that we're going to have some ability to go in and grab something that they put in their application and audit them later. They have that information now, and if the grant agreement is approved, they will have the opportunity to look at it and determine whether there are any problems with their existing application. There would be no penalty. They would simply make an amendment to the application that OPSC has before it's processed. So that's for us, that's where the dividing line was between grandfathering in, if you will, or moving the goalpost. Was if it's been processed, fine, we're going to let it go. But if it hasn't been processed yet, there's still plenty of opportunity to work with OPSC.
But when you say process, I mean, what about districts that are deep into having already entered into contracts?
That occurs in both lists, the acknowledged list and the true unfunded list. That's the nature of the program, that we get applications for projects that are underway, that the grants that come before you are for reimbursements for projects that have already occurred. That's the way the program has always operated. So that's why we feel like we will give the districts will have a window to make those modifications. Again, if they find something on the template that they did not previously understand was ineligible, I want to again reiterate the point, at least, speaking for the administration, the list of items on the template are all with a code section reference to current law, with the exception of the technology. There is nothing in the template that creates a new standard for the use of the funds, again, with the exception of the technology. Everything is already required or not required of the program. Now, could there have been misunderstandings about how?
Technology is significant.
Absolutely. The technology, I'm acknowledging it's significant and it's a change. But, it's a change that we feel very strongly is necessary for an accountability program on a bond on a bond of this size. That it's not being used for iPads or desktops or that sort of thing. So, Mr. Morales.
First of all, I want to once again thank staff for adding a lot of the suggested changes from the stakeholders. I think that we can all acknowledge that there's been a lot of progress in improving the grant agreement. A quick point of clarification, the suggested amendments that Ms. Silverman meant, we need to read the actual language as part of the motion in terms of the language that we're going to add to the grant agreement, or would that be just conforming regulations that will come later?
I think Mr. Diaz was suggesting that the items that Ms. Silverman read would be part of his motion. So they would be part of the template as it's approved.
Okay.
Yeah. The agreement and the template.
We can restate it if you like. So.
All of the clarifications that Lisa stated at the top would be part of the motion. Yeah. So we have a motion. Don't recall if we heard a second on that.
I'll second that.
Okay, so let's call the question on the grant agreement. Sam, if you could call the roll.
Okay, Senator Allen? Senator Nguyen? Aye. Senator Pan?
Aye.
Member Nazarian?
Aye.
Member Chavez?
Aye.
Member O'Donnell?
No.
Juan Morales?
Aye.
Cesar Diaz?
Aye.
Daniel Kim?
Aye.
Rene Ortega?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Now we will return to the previous motion, which is on the processing of the acknowledged list. So the motion and the second on the table are option 1, with the clear direction that the projects that might be deemed ineligible would come to us as an appeal, so we can consider those issues. So please, any further comment on that one? Please call Mr. Allen.
Well, my only comment is I support Senator Nguyen's proposal, so I'm going to vote no on this, and we'll see what the board says.
Thank you. Sam?
Senator Allen?
No.
Senator Nguyen? No. Senator Pan?
Aye.
Assemblymember Nazarian?
Aye.
Assemblymember Chavez?
Aye.
Assemblymember O'Donnell?
No.
Juan Morales?
No.
Cesar Diaz?
Aye.
Daniel Kim?
Aye.
Rene Ortega?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you. We have the consent calendar, if you all want to stay for just the consent items.
We have one action item on the appeal, sorry.
Oh, we have an appeal as well.
Really quick.
It's very quick. It's for Alameda.
I think there's no objection to the appeal item. We
Move
don't
it.
have any. Moved by Senator Nguyen, second by Mr. O'Donnell. All in favor of the appeal item, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And the consent calendar,
Thank you.
Yes, the consent calendar, we need your approval.
okay?
Second.
Okay, all in favor of the consent calendar?
Aye.
Aye. I believe everyone
So-
is still in the room, so we'll call that a
Yep.
unanimous vote, and we'll take up the minutes at the next meeting.
Okay, yeah, we also need to clarify the
Appeal and
acknowledged
consent?
lists in the
Okay.
future. We need to eliminate the record
Yeah.
to reflect the school facilities program unfunded list is withdrawn from tab 8.
Thank you.
Is that a motion?
That's a future workload, yes.
Okay,
Yes.
but you don't need a motion on that, or you do?
No.
Just
Okay.
into the
All right.
record to reflect.
All
it
right,
was
with
within
no further public comment to come before the board, we're adjourned.
What time is it? 6:29.
Wow.